Hi, everyone. Hope you're doing good. Hope your summer is going well. I don't know if you're using this time to catch up, or maybe with vacations you've gotten a little behind. Either way, that's okay. Just another encouragement, keep on going. There is blessing to be found in reading the Bible like we are. We have come to the book of Ezra and Nehemiah in our reading plan. I started that a couple days ago. I say the book of Ezra and Nehemiah. You might be wondering, well, aren't those two books? But originally they were one book put together. Only much later, after they were written, did they become two books for us. And I think that the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, it is a microcosm of the rest of the Old Testament. It reflects many of the themes that we have seen play out over and over again throughout the story of the Bible. And one of those themes is the theme of exile, that God continues to draw near to his people, but through their own sinful actions and disobedience, through hearts that turn away from God, their idolatry, they push themselves away from God. They end up in exile, and he continues to draw them back. Well, in the story of the Bible, God's people literally found themselves in exile in the land of Babylon. And in the story of Ezra and Nehemiah, we see them coming home in a sense. In these two books, we really get three main characters who feature a major role in the telling of the story. The first is a governor, a political leader called Zerubbabel. Zerubbabel is sent back to the promised land from Persia, where the people had been. And it's his job to rebuild the temple, which he does. They face some opposition, but the temple is rebuilt. But on the day when it is dedicated, there's a few problems that happen. The glory of God that came down was supposed to come down in a cloud and smoke and fire. It doesn't show up. It seems like maybe God isn't there in the temple, in his house, like he was meant to be. And besides for that, the temple is really, uh, it's a pale comparison to the temple that had been, the one that was destroyed some decades before. And there are some people there that day who had been there to see the old one. And when this new temple is rededicated, they're crying out with sadness because it's not at all what it used to be. There are some there, though, who hadn't seen the old temple. They're happy. They think this is a great moment. It's a very interesting scene. It's very anticlimactic in a lot of ways. You have been building up this hope. The people are back in the land. The temple is here. And yet it's not like it was. And maybe God hasn't even shown up. It's an interesting ending to that part of the story. Well, then some 60 years later, Ezra shows up on the scene. He's a priest and a scribe, and it's his job to teach the people the law. They had forgotten God's ways. They had wandered far, and it was his job to teach them and bring them back to the ways of God, to retell them the story and to teach them God's rules. And he does that. The people listen. There's some excitement over it. But then there's a strange ending to Ezra's story where it turns out that many of the people had intermarried with foreigners, which God had commanded them not to do because he knew that their hearts would go over to these foreign gods. And that has happened. And Ezra isn't happy with this. And so he decrees that everyone who had intermarried these foreigners must get a divorce. Now, God never told him to do that. And not even everyone follows the decree. It's another interesting kind of anticlimactic, strange ending. There's some high moments. The law is read. People seem to believe, but then here's a strange ending. People had intermarried. They're forced to divorce. We're not even sure if that's the right thing to do, and not all of them follow the rule anyway. Well, then finally we come to the story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah's job is to rebuild the wall around the city of Jerusalem. And he does that. It takes a while. There's some opposition there again, but he kind of sort of gets the job done. And yet we're left wondering again if this was the right decision. I mean, Zechariah had prophesied that God was going to rebuild the city and that it would be a city without walls so that it could welcome all people. And yet here's Nehemiah so determined to build the walls, and there's still opposition on the outside. We're wondering again, is this the right thing? Is this really what it looks like to be back in the land? It's never quite the joyful scene that we would expect it to be. You would expect after all these years, returning from exile, coming home from Babylon, that everything would be wonderful and great and full of joy, and yet story after story, in each of these three cases, we see that it's not quite that. We're left wanting or wondering, is there something more? Isn't it supposed to be better than this? It's interesting. Each of these three stories revolves around a pretty significant identity marker for the Jewish people. Right? You have Zerubbabel rebuilding the temple. The temple was a huge identity marker. We are people who worship at this temple. You have Ezra, who is teaching the law. The law was a huge identity marker. We are people who follow the law. You have Nehemiah, who's rebuilding the city wall. Jerusalem, the holy city, was a huge identity marker. People saw themselves in light of that holy city. And yet, each of these three things, even as they're restored, at least in part, isn't able to really bring the people back home, right? There's still something unsettled about this whole scene. And so, what we're seeing is that what is needed to be at home with God is faith. We're seeing this theme repeated throughout the Old Testament that God's people don't have hearts that long and yearn and trust in Him. And so they're never really quite at home. And the same is true here. For all the good that is done, for all the restoration that comes, people's hearts still aren't given over in faith to God. And so they're not quite truly at home, even though they're back living in the land. And what we see is that we need someone greater, someone outside of ourselves. That despite the best efforts of Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah, right, we need someone else, a greater hero, a greater rescuer than these three men were. This story has left us wanting and waiting for Jesus. It's a story that is meant to create some eagerness in our hearts for someone to come and do what no one else can do. And that way, I think we ought to see ourselves in the story too. We ought to see that we're really not all that different from the Israelites throughout the Old Testament. We're really not all that different from the people in the story of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Zerubbabel. Uh, we need to give our hearts over to Christ, to trust in Him for everything. And it's only in Him that we truly find our home, and we have it in Him. In Jesus, we are home and free indeed. We are welcomed and we are accepted and is right where we belong. Well, God bless your week. I hope your summer is going well again, and look forward to being back with you next time.